So this talk is going to focus on the function of macro and micronutrient requirements in the body. So as part of this topic, the overview, so we're going to look at the function of both macro and micronutrients. So we're going to focus on protein, fat, carbohydrates and micronutrients. When we come together, we're going to have a synchronous lecture on a healthy diet. So we're going to consider the NHS Eat Well plate. And then as part of our discussion, we're going to consider the 5 most common micronutrient deficiencies and how they impact on health. So the learning outcomes for this topic are to be able to characterise the requirements and recommendations of both macro and micronutrients in the body, be able to characterise what is required for a healthy diet, and be able to identify the most common micronutrient deficiencies and how they impact on health and who they impact on. So if we look at this, this diagram here, we eat food. So energy and nutrients come from food. And the top 2, calories and nutrients, sort of delineates and splits up what food means to us. So obviously food is a source of energy and it provides calories and is the thing that keeps our bodies going. And then also from food come nutrients. So they provide energy and they allow for growth and they help the body to function. So without the combination of both, obviously we wouldn't exist. So then that can be further split down in both macro and micronutrients. So as we've discussed before, macronutrients, we need them in big amounts to survive, and they also provide energy, but that's not just their sole function. So in terms of fats, some of the global things we can think about is that they help their transport mechanism for vitamins, particularly fat-soluble vitamins, so oils, butters, and such like. So your fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. And then you've got your carbohydrate. So obviously they're a major source of energy, but they also have other functions as well. So they're found in your grains, your starchy-based food. And then protein is needed to help develop bones, muscle, skin, and blood. And they're found in obviously your proteinaceous foods such as meat, fish, and your lentils, beans, and nuts. Then in terms of micronutrients, we obviously need those in small amounts. They don't provide any energy. However, they do help the metabolic function of utilizing the energy within the body. So for example, thiamine is an important cofactor for carbohydrate metabolism. So for example, in alcoholics, where they have low food intake, so they've got low thiamine stores, they develop something called Wernicke's encephalopathy, where they're unable to utilize the carbohydrate appropriately because they have a thiamine deficiency. So they don't provide energy, and they are broken down into 2 parts of minerals and vitamins. So minerals help build bones, teeth, and allow muscles to work, such as calcium, iron, sodium, and potassium. So they're important for homeostasis. And then you've got vitamins which help us to grow and stay healthy, such as vitamin C. So that's very important for collagen function. So obviously, if we have vitamin C deficiency, we end up with something called scurvy. So it's very uncommon, but even in my own clinical practice, I have seen 2 or 3 individuals with scurvy. And then obviously we've got vitamin D deficiency, or vitamin D and vitamin K, which are also vital micronutrients. So in terms of the functions of what macro and micronutrients do within the body, obviously they help, they are fundamental to cellular function, both subcellular and cellular. And obviously enzymatic and pathway function. So they're required for sort of upregulation of your genes, so RNA production, so your up and down regulation. So they're fundamental to everything. So macro micronutrients obviously end up with the increase in the number of body cells. So that's known as hypertrophy. So particularly in children obviously undergo hypertrophy from infancy through to adulthood. And they also have an increase in the number of body cells, so there's hyperplasia. So another common cause of hyperplasia is obviously cancer, where you've got aberrant cells that become rampant and become hyperplasic and grow abnormally. And then you've got changes in the proportion of body tissues that make up different body cells. And then obviously with children, you've got an increase in body size, height and mass. And in adults, you can also have an increase in body mass, but not body height. So what are some of the functions of carbohydrates? So carbohydrates supply the body with heat and energy. So extra carbohydrate is stored as fat, which is known as adipose tissue. And that's a really important component for us. And obviously as prehistoric man, we needed adipose tissue to insulate the body against and prevent heat loss. And nowadays we still need adipose tissue, but we don't perhaps need as much. For many, particularly in Western developed countries, we live in well-insulated houses, so we don't shiver a lot. So where people live in colder climates, such as, for example, Inuits, they would need increased amounts of body fat in winter to prevent heat loss. So another important function of dietary carbohydrates is its protein-sparing action. So when protein and carbohydrates are eaten together, protein is therefore then used for other function and not glucose production. So it can be used for important proteins within the blood, such as albumin, prealbumin, and also for muscle function. Some carbohydrates are also necessary in the diet so that their oxidation of fat can proceed normally, and simple sugars such as lactose promote the growth of desirable bacteria such as lactobacillus within the large intestine. So they are useful in the synthesis also of B complex vitamins. Carbohydrates also help the absorption of calcium, and a 5-carbon sugar ribose is obviously a constituent of important compounds such as DNA and RNA. So in terms of carbohydrates, as we discussed in week 1 and 2, cellulose is also a component of dietary fibre. So it's not digested in the body, so it has a really important function. So it helps push the food through the intestine, so it provides bulk and structure to your fecal matter. So it helps to aid digestion, preventing constipation. So it stimulates peristalsis, which is the contraction and the relaxation of the muscles within the intestine. And that has a really important role. So it helps prevent constipation and disease such as cancer of the large bowel. So people who have a low fibre diet have an increased risk of slow transit time within the gut. And that's thought to contribute to an increased risk of gastrointestinal cancers. So having normal transit, so aiming to stool at least once or twice a day, is considered healthy. And within Western cultures, a lot of people only defecate once every 3 days, which is considered unhealthy. So it's really important to advocate a diet that is high in fibre-containing foods. So not necessarily just cellulose or roughage, but soluble fibre as well, because soluble fibre is beneficial in terms of its prebiotic qualities. So foods that contain high amounts of Phos and Gos are thought also, or considered to be also of benefit. So the recommended dietary allowance for fibre is between 25 and 30 grams, and the average intake in the UK is between 10 and 15 grams. So the table below just has a serving size and the amount of fibre per gram. So if you, one of the things to think about would be to have a quick calculation of how much fibre you think you might take in a day. So frozen peas are really good. They've got 3.7 grams per 65 grams. Wholemeal bread, obviously a slice, is around 25 grams. That's got 1.5 grams. Potatoes are quite a good source of dietary fibre. Peanuts, and obviously all bran is a really good source. So it might be really useful to think about your own diet and how much fibre you think you're taking in. So in terms of fat, animal fats are saturated fats. So they are butter, meat, oily fish, eggs, cheese and cream. Oily fish actually aren't saturated fats. They are polyunsaturated fats, but they are omega-3. And then you've got vegetable fats that have come from plant sources. So cooking oil, nuts, cereals, and margarine. So they can be, they can represent omega-3, 6, and 9. Animal fats tend to just be saturated fats. So fats, obviously, again, they have a function to produce heat and energy. They insulate our bodies with a layer of adipose tissue, and they also, you have visceral fat. So visceral fat is something that protects your organs. So you have a fat layer around your delicate organs, such as your kidneys. But obviously what we don't want to happen is for there to be too much visceral fat, because that is negative, again, to long-term health. Fat have a really important role in satiety, so they delay hunger, as it takes longer to digest than protein or carbohydrate. So it's really important to have a mixed meal that contains fats, carbohydrates, and protein. So often people who are wishing to lose weight choose a low-fat yogurt, but actually a full-fat yogurt might be of benefit because it will delay gastric emptying further, because it's a combination of protein, fat, and carbohydrate, and therefore it will keep them feeling fuller for longer. Fats are important because they add palatability, and then you've got your essential fatty acids that are linoleic and linolenic acid that are converted into prostaglandins, thromboxanes, and prostacyclins, all of which are involved in your inflammatory response. And as previously said, that a diet that's high in omega-6 fatty acids, so linoleic acid, will have a completely different inflammatory response to a diet that's high in omega-3, such as your EPA and your DHA. So you have a diet that's high in omega-6, you're more likely to have a pro-inflammatory response, whereas in general, a diet that's high in omega-3 fatty acids, such as fatty fish, is more likely to be associated with an anti-inflammatory response. So obviously too much fat in the diet may result in obesity, and the other thing that it may cause if you have a diet that's very high in saturated fat, so your animal fats, may lead to a build-up of cholesterol in the arteries. But what's really important to also remember is that cholesterol is endogenously produced, so the body will make its own cholesterol, and cholesterol has a really, really important function within the body. It's really important for immunity. So we don't want to completely get rid of cholesterol, but for some people, or for all of us, it's probably good to reduce the amount of saturated fat that we eat. So obviously, if you have a build-up of cholesterol in your arteries, it causes a narrowing of the arteries, and this may result in hypertension, stroke, and cardiovascular disease. And cholesterol levels may rise because there's too much saturated fat in the diet, although individuals can have a genetic, they can have hyperfamilial hypercholesterolemia. So having a low-fat diet will be very difficult to control, and they're normally likely to have to require to have medication to control their cholesterol levels. So saturated fat, as I said, is present in all animal foods, and high cholesterols may lead to plaque formation in arteries. So cholesterol is a hard, waxy type of fat that builds up on the wall of the arteries, causes the arteries to become narrower, and this puts pressures on the heart to pump blood through smaller vessels. So if you think about if you have a garden hose and you step on it, it's much harder for the water to come out. So obviously higher blood pressure increases the risk of heart attack or strokes, and also hypertension then increases the risk of vascular dementia later in life. So the benefits of unsaturated fatty acids in the diet, some unsaturated fats may help reduce cholesterol. Omega-3 and 6 are also good for brain function. So arachidonic acid, eicosapentaenoic and DHA, so docosahexaenoic acid, are also good for brain function. They're all required for cell membrane. So you have a fatty lipid bilayer, and that, again, as I said, that influences your inflammatory response, the type of inflammatory response that you have. So sources of omega fatty acids, so your 3 and 6 include oily fish, seeds, and nuts. So protein are very large, complex molecules that play critical roles in the body. So protein is an amazing thing. They do work in cellular, subcellular function. So they are involved in signaling. So they have upstream and downstream effects in terms of body function. So they're required not just for the structure, but the function and regulation of the tissues and organs. So for example, leucine is involved in something called the mTOR pathway, and the mTOR pathway is responsible for insulin signaling and also for protein synthesis. mTOR pathway is also associated with something called autophagy, and autophagy is a little bit like cellular housekeeping. So the autophagic response is really important during critical illness. So we want autophagy to continue because it allows for the clearance of cellular debris from the cell. So it's a bit like housekeeping. It's a bit keeping the cell tidy. So if you have something that interferes with that, so if we're constantly giving patients, for example, protein-containing feeds, we might interfere with autophagy, and therefore we interfere with the critical processes required to overcome infection. So it's really important. So proteins also help maintain osmotic pressure. So something called albumin helps maintain your intravascular compartment. And if you have low levels of albumin, then you have increased risk of leaky. It's a bit like a watering can that develops holes. So you have your intravascular plasma leak out into your third space, and that's where you get edema. So sometimes you see people who are really unwell, they have swollen ankles. Or some elderly people have swollen ankles if they've got, or those in heart failure. So that may be that they've got reduced oncotic pressure, either due to low albumin levels or they've got heart failure. So it's really important as part of plasma proteins. So you've got lots of different kinds of plasma proteins. So you've got albumin, globulin, prealbumin, C-reactive protein, and they all have varying different functions. And obviously proteins involved in hemoglobin, enzymes, and coagulation factors. So the immune response is proteinaciously rich, and it's involved in maintaining the body's resistance to disease. And it's also involved in the control of acid-base balance in tissues where these act as a buffer. So protein has a tremendously important role within the body. So obviously you've got protein, you've got the structure outside of the cell, so it provides structures to both outside and inside the cell. You've got proteins that act as transport mechanisms, proteins that act as enzymes within the cell, and then you've also got proteins that act as cell signalers. So they're little, they have almost like little antennae or masts on the surface of the cell, so that you have cell-to-cell signaling via cell surface receptors. So if we look at some of the micronutrient functions, you've got vitamin A. So vitamin A is really important in normal iron metabolism. It's important in the maintenance of normal skin and mucous membranes in the eyes, lungs, and digestive system, maintenance of normal vision, and normal function of the immune system. So where you've got people, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, so South Africa is a good example of where many people, although surrounded by lots of tropical vegetables and fruit, there is a high index of subclinical vitamin A deficiency. So there is, for example, Blindness, so bead hot spots are common, and breakdown of mucous membranes. So, for example, transmission of HIV/AIDS is maybe more common amongst women with low vitamin A status because they have friable mucous membranes. So low vitamin A levels, severe vitamin A deficiency in the UK is rare, can lead to night blindness. So it means that you're unable to adapt to low intensity light and ulceration in the eye, which may cause total blindness. Large intakes of vitamin A can be toxic and cause liver and bone damage. And pregnant women shouldn't consume liver and liver patés as they have high levels of retinol present, which are tetragenic. So it can lead to birth defects, including cleft lip, palate, and hydrocephalus. And an estimated 250 million preschool children are vitamin A deficient, and many of those are in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. So B vitamins, they're obviously water soluble and they're needed for the release of energy from food. Thiamine helps the nervous system and heart function. So you can end up with right-sided heart failure if you have low thiamine levels. You also end up with something called Wernicke's encephalopathy, as said before, if you've got B vitamin B1 deficiency. Riboflavins needed for normal skin function, and niacins needed for normal function of the nervous system. So a really quick, easy way to remember B1, 2, and 3 is think about TRN. So that is how I remember it anyway, is thiamine, riboflavin, niacin. Pantothenic acid helps release energy from food. Pyridoxine is again used for normal nerve function and formation of hemoglobin, use of storage of energy. Biotin is essential for metabolism. Folic acid is required for red blood cell formation and is very important during pregnancy, and particularly with regards to neural tube defects in neonates or fetus. And vitamin B12 is necessary for red blood cells, nervous system, and processing of folic acid. So there are some synergistic relationships. B12 deficiency is also associated with spinal cord damage, and you can get paralysis. So whole unprocessed foods are good sources. So this is why B vitamins are also added to processed cereal products, because the problem with whole grain foods is that they often contain lots of anti-nutrients, so phytates, which also then prevent the absorption of B vitamins. So B vitamin deficiencies may occur during vegan and vegetarian diets, also with the use of some medications. They're associated with macrocytic anemia, so B9 and 12, which is also known as pernicious anemia, and you have larger than normal red blood cells which can't function properly. And then, as I said, if you've got alcoholism and thiamine, that also is an issue. So vitamin C has the normal functioning of the immune system, formation of collagen for normal blood vessels, bones, cartilage, gums, skin, and teeth, protection of cells from oxidative stress, and aids iron absorption if eaten with iron. So if you've got non-heme source, so vegetarian source, and you eat, have a glass of orange juice with it, you then help the redox of that to convert it to the bioavailable form, which is heme. So when you have deficiency, you've got bleeding gums, poor wound healing, fatigue, muscle weakness, aching joints and muscles, and that can also result in heart failure. So vitamin D has many functions. It's required for the absorption and resorption of calcium and phosphorus, so required for normal bones, teeth, muscle function, calcium levels, and immune system. So vitamin D is really important for your muscle function, particularly of your heart. So again, if you've got a vitamin D deficiency, you can end up with something called cardiomyopathy. So if we have children coming into, for example, the intensive care, we will then look to see whether or not they are vitamin D deficient. Vitamin K is needed for normal blood clotting and bone structure. It's found in green leafy vegetables, broccoli, cabbage, lettuce, spinach. It's also produced by bacteria in the gut, particularly of adults. And a deficiency of vitamin K is very rare in adults. but it is sometimes seen in newborn babies. So all babies are given either a vitamin K injection and or drops at birth. So iron obviously is used to form hemoglobin in red blood cells, so it's required for the transport of oxygen around the body, and it's also required for normal metabolism. So if you have someone who's got iron deficiency anemia, they may be very breathless. Again, it can result in heart failure, and they may have low levels of oxygen saturation in their blood as a result. Calcium, so obviously calcium, again, a bit like vitamin D, is important for bones and teeth, blood clotting, muscle and nervous system, energy production, and normal function of the digestive enzyme. So calcium is also important in cardiac function as well, and cardiac contractility. Magnesium, very important for DNA and protein synthesis, used in blood clotting, muscle contraction, and ATP production. So again, magnesium is particularly required for heart and cardiovascular function. Potassium, again, normal functioning of the nervous system, muscle function, again, it's important for the heart, and maintenance of normal blood pressure. So if you have hypokalemia, which are low levels of potassium, then you'll have arrhythmias and you will have low blood pressure as a result. Zinc is a cofactor for many enzymes, and they're known as zinc fingers, and gene regulation and immune health. And zinc in children is required for growth and also for skin. So often children with a zinc deficiency will have something called acrodermatitis. So they end up with either flaky paint skin, or they end up with skin, it looks like eczema around their mouth and their napkin area. Selenium is required for thyroid metabolism, immune function, and it's also an important antioxidant and required in your glutathione redox pathway. Phosphorus is required for the maintenance of normal bones and teeth, energy production, and normal function of cellular membrane. So phosphorus and thiamine are really important, particularly in energy production. And if someone has been starving or has had abnormal losses for a long time, they may end up with something called refeeding syndrome. And often you end up, when you start giving carbohydrate, you end up with this precipitous, you stimulate insulin production, and you end up with this, it's almost like a hoover. The cells suck in all phosphorus, potassium, magnesium into the cell as a result of insulin, and you end up with respiratory dysfunction as a result, and you can have respiratory arrest. Sodium is required for fluid balance and the absorption of water and certain nutrients from the gut. So this is a really whistle-stop tour of all the functions of macro and micronutrients, and obviously it's very top line. There are lots of things that you can read about if you're interested in more, but essentially there is a myriad of function that many of the micronutrients and macronutrients that are required for in the body, and it's astounding to think that all of those come from food.